All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Julian Cuevas. I am the Director of Policy and Governmental Affairs for the Inland Empire Community Foundation. We are here joined by some fabulous people who are, really don't need any introduction, but these are experts in the field of legislation and budget for the state of California. And so what we're going to be focusing on today in our workshop series, really highlighting the policy capacity building for the Inland Empire. And really, I know we have folks here from throughout the state and throughout the region. So welcome to you all as well. This will also apply to from wherever you are calling from or logging in from in the state of California. So thank you for being here. But today we are going to be focusing on legislative policy capacity building. What is the legislative process look like here in the state of California? How do we maneuver through such a complex process? But we're going to make it tangible for you today. Well, we're going to give you a quick overview of what the process looks like, but more importantly, how can you all engage effectively and efficiently to better be able to advocate for your constituents, your clients, your community, and really seeing opportunities of where you might be able to advocate for bills. And maybe tomorrow we'll talk more as well around the budget, the process. But without further ado, today's presentation will only be about an hour long. And so with us today, we have, of course, Leah Barrows from Leah Barrows LLC, expert, of course, in really just advocating, lobbying here in the state of California. So she brings some extensive insight, really just a powerhouse here. So I'm really excited to have you here. So thank you, Leah, for being here with us today. And of course, we have Kaim Jackson, a great friend of mine, great colleague, also, a force to be reckoned with here, someone who's very familiar not only with the state process, but also the federal process. And so they will both be here today to discuss not only, again, the overview of what the legislative process looks like, they're going to give you some insights as to how they believe you all could best really engage in this space. So I will take a step back, and Leah and Kaim, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you, Julian. You want to kick us off, Leah? How about that?
Yeah, so just to kind of give you a brief overview of what I do. So I'm a contract lobbyist. I have my own very small contract lobbying firm. I got my start working in politics, working for Senator Susan Eggman, who was an assembly member at the time. I worked for her for 3 years before I started lobbying. And a lot of people have a somewhat of an idea of what lobbyists do, but not really kind of a broad kind of understanding. So basically what I do as a lobbyist is I have clients and I represent their interests before the California State Legislature, governor's office, and state agency. So if there's a bill that's going through the legislative process that helps their business, then I work on their behalf to make sure that it gets through the legislative process and signed into law by the governor. If there's a bill that they don't like that's going through the legislative process, then it's my job to help to neutralize the bill, to kill it, amend it to make it better, or just make it so that it doesn't hurt the company or organization in a way it came into as written into law. So that's a little bit about what I do, boots on the ground, and why I have all the experience that I had doing this. I've been doing it for about 7 years now on the lobbying end. So that's a little bit about me.
Leah, that's a wonderful background, and I appreciate that. And it's a great opportunity to be here with you and Julian and all of the folks from around California and the Inland Empire. Again, my name's Kai Jackson. My background started at the international level and the federal level as the Deputy Director of Legislative Affairs for the Marine Corps. And that's where I really cut my teeth, so to speak, in terms of working with countries around the world on helping to affect prosperous democracies. I transitioned into the education space and worked for San Diego Unified School District for a period of time there. And then I worked for the Department of Education as a Deputy State Superintendent of Public Instruction. So it's been a very good career. I've learned some things, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of those experiences with our attendees here today. And I know we have a short time, so I'd like to just hop into it. I will kick us off and go to our next slide here. And let's just jump right into it. Here's just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking about the legislative process, particularly focused on California. Our goal is not to make you experts in this process, but to really just give you some fundamentals so that as you work on your goals, you're able to be more effective in that process. We're going to talk about how a idea gets generated, how that idea becomes a bill, and hopefully how that bill becomes a law. And we're going to talk about everything in between that process. I would just also say up front, the why this is important. The reality is we're all citizens of our community, citizens of our state, and most of us really want to make things happen, make a positive impact. And in so doing, sometimes it's necessary to engage your legislators, both either at the state or locally, so that they can help advocate for you and move policy or move state statute.
Right. And I'll just add to that, like it's very important for people to be comfortable with the process and to have relationships with their elected officials. Because when you really think about it, the laws that are passed by the legislature, they have a direct impact on all of our lives, right? So they affect anything from the taxes that we pay to the number of children allowed in classrooms to how healthcare is distributed. So it's very important to at least have a good idea of the process so that if there's ever something that you want to engage in, you know how to do that.
Oh, that's a great point. And before we kick in, this is really cool. I was thinking, Leah, although we can't see all of our participants, and I know we're talking to them, I'd love for us to be conversational as well as we go through this. So in terms of rule of engagement, hopefully you don't mind if I'm asking you some questions and picking your brain, and feel free to do the same. And we might pick on Julian there too and ask him some questions because we know he has a lot of experience in this space. And for those out there watching, please, as Julian mentioned, please feel free to either use the chat function or the Q&A function, and we'll either try to get to those in stride or toward the end, we'll go back through there. All right, key players. I mean, in anything we do, there are always those that are key players, key influencers. Sometimes we call them political decision makers or policy decision makers. In California, there are a few folks that have a lot of decision authority. You see them right up there. Certainly our governor, Gavin Newsom, we have him listed basically under the administration. And for today's discussion, we'll talk about the horseshoe. We'll also talk about the Department of Finance and how they play in this process. We'll also talk about our legislature. And when we're talking about our legislature, we're really talking about our state assembly, and we're talking about our state Senate, as opposed to the U.S. House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate, right? It's a little bit different. We'll talk about the influence and the role of their staffs and the committees, et cetera. But let me throw one thing out. Leah, I think it's always an interesting fact, and I think a lot of people think every state legislatures operate the same, but they don't. California's legislature is very robust. They operate every year, and they meet for an extensive period of time. And we'll talk about that time. But every state legislature doesn't meet every year. For example, the state of Nevada does not meet every year. Their state legislature meets every other year. And in the good state of Arizona, their legislature, even though they meet each year, it's a very small window of time. And so with that said, maybe you could provide some of your thoughts on the role of the staff or the committees in the legislature, or maybe just kick us off with some thoughts, Leah.
Yeah, so I would say, just to kind of give a broad overview, is the Senate is considered the upper house. So they're made up of 40 members, and they represent close to 1 million constituents. So they have a lot of people that they're representing. Then on the assembly side, that's made up of about 80 members, and they represent close to about 500,000 constituents. Legislators, term limits changed back in, I think it was like about 2012 or something like that, where legislators can now serve 12 years. So there was a proposition, Prop 28, that passed. So for senators, they can serve any combination of four-year terms. And then in the assembly, they can serve any combination of 2-year terms equaling 12 years in both houses. And you can mix them up. So if you're in the assembly and then a Senate seat opens up, then you can run for the Senate seat and then count that towards your 12 years. So that's kind of just a background of how the makeup of the Senate and the Assembly works.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that background. I'm sure there are many folks watching us that have been in this space for a long time, and they saw how things operated before Prop 28, and they're seeing how things are operating now, which is very interesting. And that points to a thing, and maybe we'll get some Q&A about it. But because of that, those term limits, we think there's going to be a significant amount of change in our legislature come this November. And what it looks like, or what the leadership looks like next year, will be perhaps a different ballgame. Mm-hmm. So with that, why don't I go to our next slide here? And this is the meaty portion of what we'll talk about. We'll pause here on this slide for a while as a background, but we'll speak to it. And maybe I'll just kick it over to Leah to talk about this legislative process, where it starts at and how we get toward the end, and we can just go back and forth. How about that?
Yeah. So when Kai mentioned that all legislation begins with an idea, he's 100% spot on. So bill ideas can come from issues that are happening in the district, citizen requests, advocates. Pretty much anyone can come up with a bill idea, bring it to a legislator or his or her staff, shop the idea, and run the process to help make that bill become a law. So after you have a solid bill idea, how do you guide it through the legislative process? Really, it's simple. It all starts with drafting. What are you trying to do, right? So typically, the first draft of language comes from the advocates, legislative staff, and then they hand it off to what's called legislative counsel. And legislative counsel is comprised of a team of attorneys who work for the legislature. And they put in draft language into all the legal language that is hard for a lot of us who don't have law degrees to understand. And then they prepare bill summaries and get it prepared for the bills to be read. So the bill readings are basically, they call them readings, but it's just basically your steps in the process. So first reading would be when your language is submitted across the desk. So you have your language in Leg Council form and you cross it over the Assembly desk or the Senate desk and you say, this is my bill, and it gets a bill number. So that's going to be SB, whatever the number is for a Senate bill, or AB, whatever the number is for an Assembly bill. That's the first action that's taken on it. Second reading is when the bill is heard in necessary committees, right? So that's that policy committee point on the chart. And that policy committee process is actually pretty cool because the author of the bill, the senator or assembly member, presents the bill. You have your witnesses, and then it's debated upon. So whatever members are on the policy committee, they get to ask questions about the bill, whether they're questions that, are in support of the bill or questions that are picking apart the bill because they have issues with it. And then once it gets through policy committee, most bills are going to have to go to fiscal committee, and fiscal committee is appropriations, right? So that's where bills go if they have financial implications. And I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but it gets kind of funky in appropriations because there's this thing called the suspense file that we all love. And the suspense file is kind of where bills are parked if they have a significant cost to the state. Well, it's not even really that significant. It's like $50,000 in the Senate and $150,000 in the Assembly. So they're placed on this special file. And once it's there, the author has to negotiate with Senate and Assembly leadership and appropriations committee chairs, and lobby internally for the bill to get off of suspense. And if it gets off of suspense, then it continues through the legislative process, goes to the floor, and the floor is what's called third reading. So remember, all these different readings are different points in the process. So third reading is when the author presents the bill on the floor and the entire Senate or entire Assembly debates the bill, votes on it, and then it passes. So the crazy thing about the process is that you have to do it twice. So bills that start in the assembly, you go through that whole process. And then if it gets to the assembly off of the floor, then you have to swap houses and do it all again in the Senate. So it can be a bit of a pill. Kai, I don't know, do you want me to go over bill referrals, like double referrals, and how, they decide what committee a bill goes to?
Well, let's do this. I love how you took us through the big blue arrow, as I like to say. You went from the bill is introduced through the next step, which is the policy committee. Then we went to the floor action, and then we swap sides. But perhaps what we can do is take a little time and sort of dissect the process and just go through it. I think I was keying in on your part about when the bill gets introduced, and I know you and Julie and I talked about it before. How do you even choose a author to introduce your bill? The Inland Empire Community Foundation works with a lot of nonprofits, and a lot of them have ideas. I live in Temecula. It's in the Inland Empire, and a lot of folks have ideas to make their communities better. So that's what brings us here today. So maybe we can just chop up some thoughts on bill authors. I think that's one of the most important parts of a successful legislative process or advocacy process. And I know you'll talk about that later in the week, but the Inland Empire Community Foundation has worked with Senator Leyva, for example. She's been a champion for early ed and for education. And I would just say that one of the most important parts is choosing a good bill author, someone who will advocate for your idea and do, as Leah said, introduce the bill. Julie and Leah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's a member who's going not only to advocate best for your bill, but also someone who's very familiar with the issue area, right? If it's an early education bill, for example, selecting a member that's, either part of the Women's Caucus or is a staunch advocate for early education, childcare, familiar with the process, has great relationships in that space, really is a difference maker. Oftentimes, your favorite member isn't always the best one to go to for certain topics, right? And so just being well aware of, who is your best candidate or your best elected official for housing, who's the best one for economic development. Everyone really has a powerhouse or a power wheel, shall we say. So just being cognizant of that, I think, is always it's a challenge, right? Because in the Inland Empire, we have over a dozen or so elected officials that we could tap on, but how do you do it in a way where you get there fast enough, early enough in the process, so that you are one of the 25 bills that gets picked up for the next cycle? I don't know. What are your thoughts, Leah?
Oh, no, I agree 100%. There's also internal dynamics that you have to be careful of, right? So if your bill has anything to do with like an issue, say, that impacts a caucus, right? So you have your Latino caucus, API caucus, Black caucus. Sometimes you have to kind of go to the caucus and say, I have this issue that we're trying to address that impacts XYZ community. And we want to give, the caucus right of first refusal to, to back the bill, to champion the bill. Who do you think would be a good member for us to approach? And if you get early buy-in from the caucus, then they typically will give you stronger support and champion the bill behind the scenes for you. So even taking consideration of little things like that's very important when choosing an author.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, once again, for those that are attending, I know this diagram looks something akin to a Rube Goldberg machine, but I promise you, the more you see this and the more we just participate in these capacity building process, it'll look a little bit less foreign to you all. Once you identify a potential bill author, you'll go to them. And, legislators have a certain number of bills that they can introduce during the legislative session. And I'll step back. I think I forgot to mention California's process, or California's legislative session, is actually a two-year session. The first year of the session And then there's the second year of the session. And we'll talk about how a bill can go through a process in more than 1 year, sometimes perhaps 2 years. And so Leah talked about once you get that author to introduce your bill, they'll send it to the legislative council and they'll do some drafting and they'll decide what policy committees this bill is germane to. And I know she talked about, and I think now, if you'd like, Leah, talk about how a bill could be dual referred, perhaps. What do you think?
Yeah, so the policy committee process it's very important. So I can't stress enough how much committee assignments impact the bill's chance of successfully making it through the legislative process. It's a very critical action. And that's why you want to be very careful in how the language is drafted. This is because the makeup of certain committees can make passage of the bill more difficult just based on the nature of the bill, how the members on the committee tend to vote, organization, lobbyist relationships with committee members, all that makes a huge difference. And then like Kai said, bills can be double referred and sometimes even triple referred. So if the nature of the bill touches 2 or 3 different policy committees, the chairs of those committees are going to want that bill to go through their committee so that they can debate the bill, so that they can make sure that they have say in how the bill is crafted, what works, what doesn't work. One thing I also want to say is that when you're running legislation, don't get married to the idea that what you craft in the beginning is what you're going to get in the end, because these bills get cut up, mangled, flipped upside down, and you have to be okay with change, compromise, and getting very creative in how to make solutions work, so that if it's a bill that's very important to you, try to find a couple different ways that it can work, so that if you have opposition, you'll have some negotiating power to go into. But in terms of double and triple unfurls, what that means is that you pretty much have to repeat the same process that I talked about before with the policy committee multiple times. So if you're going through education and health committee, you have to debate the bill in both committees. You have to lobby both committees like it's your first time doing it each time. So it makes it a little bit more stressful and time consuming, because that means that when you have multiple times that you're in committee, your bill has more chances to fail. So you have to be very, very careful in how you navigate that process.
Yeah, I love it. And you know, as you were talking, I looked up at the title and it said legislative process. Although I like what you were getting at. I think you were getting at, I'm going to rename this slide, the collaborative problem solving process, right? So, because a bill, the foundation supported a bill this year, actually, 2806, and it was referred to Health and Human Services and the Education Committee. And through that process, there were a lot of collaborative problem solvers who changed the bill and, like you said, cut things up, and it came out a little bit differently as it awaits signature on the governor's test. Mm-hmm. But as you mentioned before, once it goes through that collaborative problem solving process, it either has a cost associated with it or no cost. Clearly, you can see if it has no cost, which it's difficult for things to have like technically no cost. It would go directly to the floor, which we mean the full either Senate or Assembly. But if a bill does have a cost, and as Leah mentioned, it doesn't have to be very significant in state dollars, $50,000 or $100,000 are relative nominal costs. And sometimes you'll hear loose advocacy language, we'll call it budget dust. I mean, given the size of California's economy. But if it does go to that fiscal committee, it's a very important step in the process. And this is where you'll start to see some of the bills kind of fall off. Mm-hmm. So bills are introduced. Generally, there's a deadline for introduction in February, usually toward the 3rd or 4th week of February. There's dates set. It'll go through the policy committee, and then it'll get to the fiscal committee. There's deadlines right around the end of March timeframe, April timeframe. And once it's in fiscal committee, those bills will either be passed or held on suspense. And if they're held on suspense, I don't necessarily like using the term, it's a tough term for an advocate, they're dead. Right. And so those bills are no longer moving forward. And that can be for a number of reasons, not just the cost. Usually the state agency of jurisdiction and the Department of Finance will analyze the cost of the bill, and that's where those costs come from. What would you say, perhaps Julian, about like efforts to get your bill off of suspense or get it through that fiscal committee? I know you've seen that process before.
Yeah, the biggest thing is advocacy, right? So, some of you that are on this call right now, in this meeting right now, have been a part of our policy, strategy sessions in the last year. We're going to pick that up again here in the next few weeks. But during that process, right, you're building a coalition, you're building a network. And so submitting letters of support, ensuring that you're calling or engaging with the elected officials, right, especially the committee staff, if you're able to reach out. And I'm sure we're going to touch on that here in just a few moments. But ultimately, that's what it comes down to. I mean, once there's a cost slapped onto your bill and it goes into suspense, and suspense, just think of it as, it's what it is. We're suspensefully waiting, right, to see what's going to happen with the future of this bill. And as we wait, that's an opportunity to advocate. And hopefully what we do in advance too, and Kai and I have worked on this a bit in the past, where you try to hopefully identify costs ahead of time, right? So you have time to work it out with committee staff and others to ensure that, we've identified some costs, as opposed to, submitting it without some sort of trajectory or some sort of budget or item on there. And then you find out later down the road that there's a cost to it. It freaks some people out, and it might, jeopardize your bill moving forward. So I think better organizing in advance before it gets to that point, which is what we're trying to do with you all here in the region, I think does give the bill a bit of a leg up.
Yeah.
I would say, sorry, Kai, but just to kind of loop back to what you said about the importance of choosing an author, is that another reason why it's important to be careful about who you choose is that a lot of the weight of what gets off of suspense is put on the author prioritizing their bills, right? So you want to choose an author who is going to love the bill, who's going to prioritize it, who's going to champion it, because the higher up it goes on that prioritization, the better you're going to do. So you want members, if it's a bill that has a hefty price tag and is going to be a tough sell, you want a member who is going to prioritize it. You want a member who has great relationships with other members, who's strong and tight with leadership, so that they'll do all the things that need to be done behind the scenes to make sure that the bill gets off. And then you're doing all that you can do. You're, the advocacy, the social media push, meeting with the approach consultants and all the powers that be. So then you have a dual tracks, rather than just as the sponsor doing all the work on the front end and then having the author ranking you as like number 10,
Yeah, this is great. That is so spot on. I am one of those folks, I always have to go back to the beginning and come. So by the end of this thing, it's crystal clear in my mind, and it doesn't look like this Rube Goldberg machine. So that's why we're spending a lot of time on this first half, because Leah said, hey, you're going to do the first half in the first house, and then you're essentially going to repeat the process in the second house. So let me go back. Bill is introduced. That means I've, for lack of better words, I've collaborated with and in agreement with a legislator that the issue is worth him or her writing a bill on or authoring a bill. So then that takes me to the policy committee. In about February, there's a deadline to introduce bills. The bill goes to Ledge Council and it's referred to a committee of jurisdiction, that policy committee. And in that committee, like we said, you're really discussing or debating, depending how you want to look at it, the policy, right? The impact. Some people will agree with you, some people will disagree with you. Let's just break it down that way. And then there's a cost or no cost. Remember, there's very little bills that have no cost. There are some, but for today's conversation, we're going to focus on having a nominal cost. Then it goes to that fiscal committee, where we really have an opportunity to talk about its merits of California perhaps putting some of its budget behind the policy. So they're different. One, we're talking about policy, the impact. One, we're talking about the budget impact, and we're not sort of revisiting that policy conversation. So in my mind, I like to talk about, I believe this is worth California putting some of its budget behind, right? Because we know our state demonstrates its priorities where they place their budget. And so if we get through that process, it's a big hurdle, and we go to the floor, as Leah said. And so one thing to note is, not at this point, you're at floor action. Not every member of the Senate or the Assembly has had an opportunity to see your bill. So this will be the first time that essentially everyone in that side of the House, either the Assembly or the Senate, has a chance to vote on that bill. So your advocacy takes probably a broader reach and a little bit of different of a tone. And we won't go into all the details. We do know we'll be talking about advocacy later, but it'll go to the floor. And at that point, if it gets a thumbs up on the floor, and that also means it'll get a vote from either the Senate Pro Tem or the Assembly Speaker, it'll move to the other side of the Capitol, so to speak. So now we're in the second House, and we start that all over again. But it may not look the same. There may be some amendments, and I wouldn't take amendments as a bad thing. I would take amendments as what Leah said, compromise, an opportunity to build a better bill from having heard from sometimes the other side, sometimes people who agree with you, but they have a different lens on how to get it done. What do you two think? Am I in the right room?
Yeah, no, you're spot on.
All right.
To be honest, a lot of that is done through just like the committee process of vetting it with committee consultants. Because committee consultants, I mean, they're often there longer than members. You have some committee consultants that have been consultants for like 20, 25 years. So they know these issues inside and out. They know the pitfalls, they know the third rail politics behind certain things, they know what the agency is going to think. So there are certain things that you just don't know because you don't know, right? But the committee consultants, they know where all the bodies are buried, so they can help you, right? So as long as you come to it from the perspective of being open to making it better, sometimes amendments don't make it worse. Sometimes they really do strengthen the bill. Then that just puts you in a better position.
If I may, just do a quick pulse check with everyone. I jokingly put in the chat if we've lost anyone yet. So as you can see, it's a complex process, and for Leah and Kai to be able to try to sum that up in about 15 minutes is an art. Just know, as we continue through this presentation, the things that you're hearing, you're not expected to do that. It's folks like myself and Leah and Kai and others who do this sort of heavy lifting for agencies, elected officials, nonprofit organizations, whether you're a lobbyist or an advocate. There are folks who actually do this work on your behalf. But there is an opportunity that we'll get to here in a moment, is how do you sort of influence that? Like, how are you making sure that your point of view, your needs are being advocated in these spaces that you can see move very fast, are very complex. But as long as we know what it is you're looking for and what sort of resources and solutions you need to do the work that you do, that you got folks like us on this screen and others that are out there doing the work for you. I want to pause there. Sorry, Kai, go for it, brother.
No, that's great. I appreciate it, and I know we'll have an opportunity to speak to that a little bit more. And so we're going to go through this process here, and we're going to get to the governor, and then we're going to get to some meaty portions, some other meaty portions. So we're going to go through that process again. I will say that once you go through that initial floor action, you go to the second House. You get through that second fiscal committee, and then if there are, once it goes to the floor, at that point, if there are additional amendments or refinements or creative collaborative problem solving, right? Those amendments, if they're substantive, it'll need to go back to the first House of origin, get concurrence before it could go to the governor's desk. And so there's some timelines associated with this. Those are posted. We won't go through those in details, but we can send them afterwards. But let's just talk a little bit what happens when a bill is passed and signed on both sides of the House, both sides of the legislature, excuse me, and what happens then. I'll just throw out one term. Once it's passed, it goes to something that they call enrolling and engrossing. Cool names, I think. But Leah, would you be willing to talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, so just to back it up a little bit, in order for a bill to get, and I don't, you guys probably already know this, but just to kind of make sure that we're not skipping over anything, when a bill gets, or in order for a bill to get off of the floor, they need 21 votes in the Senate or 41 votes in the Assembly. If the bill requires an amendment to like the Constitution, or if there's an emergency clause, or if there's, you know, a change in taxes, then it requires a 2/3 vote. And that's 27 votes in the Senate and 54 in the Assembly. So once it passes through and goes back for concurrence, if it has any amendments and gets through the process and goes through engrossing and enrolling. Engrossing and enrolling is pretty much a process where it just kind of waits in limbo. And they have some folks behind the scenes who are looking at the language to make sure that everything is as it should be, like all of the codes are matching up, everything is chaptered out the way it needs to be, making sure there are no crazy typos, or all of the commas and periods are where they're supposed to be. Because as you know, a comma in the wrong place can completely change everything. So that's where the folks behind the scenes are just making sure that everything is ready and perfect for it to get to the governor's office. And then when it gets to the governor's office, that's when his legislative deputies go through all the bills with him and kind of just break down the policy, the politics, where everybody is on it, who's in support, who's in opposition, where does agencies stand on it, all those sorts of things. Was there anything else you wanted me to talk about with the engrossing and enrolling?
No, I love it. And I'm listening to you, and I'm looking at some questions. So those that are attending, be sure we're going to get to your questions. I see in there. I learned, I have to say, I still feel that I'm a neophyte in this space. So I learned something new this year. We had a bill, and it passed both sides of the legislature. It went to enrolling and engrossing. And I thought at that point, man, in 12 days, I'm going to know whether this bill is either signed into law. You know, I thought it was going to the governor at that time. So I said, we have 12 days, and it's either going to be signed into law, vetoed, or the governor could not take action, and then something happens there, only to learn that it goes through that process and it makes sure everything dot the I's, cross the T's, like you said, and then they'll publish, it was sent to the governor's desk on this day at this time, and that's when that 12-day rule starts. Perhaps we could chew on the 12-day rule and the 30th of September. Perhaps we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so and just also to paint a picture for you, engrossing and enrolling, it can be, a bill can be sitting in there for a minute, like a week or two, and you're just like waiting, like, has it gone to the governor yet? And you're like, no, you just got to be patient, because sometimes it's 3 days, sometimes it's 2 weeks, you just never know. So the governor signing. So typically, and I say typically because there's always an exception depending on kind of where you are in the legislative cycle. But typically the governor has, like Kai said, 12 days after receiving a bill to take action. So taking action is like signing the bill into law or vetoing it. There's also him taking no action, right? So that even that in and of itself is kind of taking action. So if the governor receives a bill after a certain time period during the end of session, which is like the last, 2 weeks of session, or after the legislature adjourns, then he has 30 days to take action. If no action is taken, then the bill automatically becomes a law without his signature. If he takes action, then that means he's either signing it into law or he's vetoing it. Now, the legislature can override a veto, but that very rarely ever happens, because in order to do so, you need like a 2/3 vote in both houses, and it's very difficult to do. But that in a nutshell is kind of how the governor's signing period works. And it's just one of those things where when you're waiting for your bill, in that kind of in between space, when the bill has gone to the governor's office and you're doing your advocacy and you're waiting, it's really tough because you're a lot of times not getting a lot of feedback from his leg deputies. So by this time you should have already met with the leg deputy that handles that issue area. So he has a whole host of deputies. They have different issue areas, and whatever policy committee your bill went through first is the issue area that you want to pinpoint for whatever leg deputy that you reach out to lobby your bill to them. Because you always want to make sure you send in letters and have people advocate, but nothing beats having that one-to-one phone conversation, meeting, Zoom meeting, whatever, because inevitably there are just certain things and subtle nuances that it's just very difficult to get through in a letter. So you want to be able to have that conversation, give them the opportunity to ask questions or address any concerns that they might have. Sometimes those meetings are 30 minutes if you're lucky, but most of the time you're getting about 15.
Oh, you're so spot on. Now let me say, you got me thinking. We're down at the, this is probably when your bill gets that far, you're at the 5-yard line or something. And I was in the Marine Corps, and I like to play aggressive offense. But let me just say something, and let me caveat this by saying I don't advocate for this. I don't believe that this is how folks should operate, because I like to operate transparently. But you know what I've seen on the opposite side? Sometimes you got to play that defense. I've seen folks not engage on a bill that goes through this whole process. And I'm looking here. I think there was someone, I can't pronounce her name, but KHALSA. She asked, how long does it take for a bill to become law? And we'll talk about when laws go to effect. But typically, this process from start to finish we talked about starts in about, January, February, and it's done by the end of September, or so the 30th of September. But I've seen individuals or organizations not engage in the process of collaborative problem solving. And when the bill goes to the governor, guess what they come in and do? They oppose the bill. They oppose the bill on the 1-yard line. And that is, I don't advocate for that. I think that's not operating transparently and trying to solve. But so to Leah's point, you have to continue to talk to those deputies in the governor's office, make sure they know why this is important and why California should either have this as a policy and place some of their budget typically behind this idea. And so once the governor acts on a bill, if he signs the bill, sometimes there's a governor's message behind it, but definitely if he vetoes a bill, there's typically always a governor's veto message with it. And you can find that on their website after the fact. So
and there are certain things, and not to get too strategy focused, but for you folks that really are thinking about running, legislation and sponsoring bills, there are certain strategies that you have to think of when you're engaging with the governor's office too. So if you have a governor's office early, a meeting with the governor's office early, and there's an indication that they have a strong issue with the bill, they don't like the bill, you can kind of tell, oh, this is veto bait, right? Sometimes it behooves you to park your bill and not even send it to the governor's office. Because if you send it to the governor's office and it gets vetoed, you get that veto message and you try to run the bill again next year, everybody's gonna ask you, well, why was the bill vetoed? Did you fix what the governor didn't like? What's the process gonna be now? And that's just always a hurdle that you're gonna have to overcome. So sometimes strategy-wise, you wanna tank your own bill just to save it so that you can come back next year stronger. And that's another reason why it's important to have those types of meetings early. One of the things I always tell people is communicate early and communicate often in this process, because you could be going full steam ahead and then have one wrong thing happen just because you didn't talk to the right person, and whoosh, shoots and ladders, you're all the way back down to the beginning.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. What a great lead into the right strategy can make all the difference. A colleague told me once, it's almost like political acupressure, right? Nuanced language there, but the right strategy, the right coalition can make all the difference. Which is a good segue. I know we're coming up on some time here, so I want to make sure we get to this, and I do want to make sure we get to some of those questions. But I won't read all of that, but this says the dynamics, empowerment of the unelected, and that's not a bad thing. It's actually a positive thing. What Leah talked about was legislative staff become increasingly influential, right? In terms of being there, institutional knowledge. Many of these individuals It's their careers, and so they become very, very familiar with the process and the issues. And she also touched on increased dependency on the third house or policy experts. Sometimes that's a good way of saying, or a nice way of saying, lobbyists or advocates. And a lot of folks, they think lobbying is sort of a dirty word, but it is not. People lobby or advocate for very great things: education, cures for cancer, etc. And so on this slide actually says parent voices became even stronger during the pandemic, but I probably perhaps should have put just stakeholder voices. Your stakeholders here, you have an issue, and your voices together amplify. And so yeah, what do you think about that?
I want to double back. I want to make sure we answer that question about when bills go into law. Just so we don't forget. So normally bills will become law January 1st of the following year. The exceptions to that are when the bill specifies an effective date. So if it has a specific date, say it's, April of the following year, then that overrides the January 1st kind of implementation date. The other exception are like urgency bills. Urgency bills will become effective immediately when the governor signs it. And after a bill passes, what happens is it passes the legislature, it's signed into law, then it goes to the Secretary of State and it's chaptered into law. And that's when it's an official law on the books in code, and it's a done deal.
So that's when we pop out the sparkling water at that point. Okay, I like it. I like it. Julian, did we miss anything on that process generally? Once again, I know we're not making people experts, but just hopefully putting some fundamental seeds in the soil.
No, thank you, Kai. And this is really just helpful, right? For everyone on this call, many of you have joined us again in those strategy sessions in the last year, and hopefully we'll see you again in the next few weeks for this year's round. The purpose of all of this, right, as you can see, is that it's complex. It's complex, but there are certainly many windows of opportunity within this process to engage, to advocate. Many of you on this call are small nonprofit organizations and don't have necessarily the capacity to engage in this space. Just know that there are folks like us, that are here to do the Lord's work for you, is what we call it in the policy world, right? We're doing the Lord's work, and just don't feel. I know it could be a bit overwhelming to see this and the nuances that go into this work, but there are professionals out there that do this stuff for a living. And so if and I'm just going to kind of back off of that for a moment, but just wanted to at least preface that to Kai's question, if there's anything missing. There really isn't anything missing. I think what we're going to find tomorrow and again on Friday we'll engage more about how nonprofit organizations can engage without compromising your 501c3 status, which is super important. So leveraging folks like us will certainly be an avenue for all of you, but just be mindful, right? Be mindful that this is a lengthy process. And I say lengthy because, it's really not even a full year. What are we talking, like 9 months, 10 months for the first year, again, 9-10 months for the second year, but it moves fast. It moves fast. And I think some of the things that you'll notice, especially for some of the nonprofit organizations on this call, is, some of you have to go back to your board and get approval to engage in this thing, whatever it's a bill or a budget play. A month, 2 months go by the time your board meets and approves it, like your bill is probably looking different and in a completely different space. And you're going to have to go back and ask again. So, hopefully we'll have some opportunities to engage with you throughout the week to figure out how can we help your organizations better streamline your engagement, because policy moves fast. And that's definitely not how the nonprofit sector certainly operates. Leah, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on that.
No, you're spot on. Things once everything gets going, it does move very fast. I would say just because the legislature isn't in session during the fall months doesn't mean that you shouldn't still be out there laying tape, right? You're always laying the foundation, taking advantage of the time that you're not in committee all the time because the legislatures are in their districts. And what the fall is used for is getting your bill ideas ready, strategizing on who you want to approach for who can be a good author for the bill, because one thing that we didn't touch on is that good authors go very quickly, right? So you want to start early and have everything vetted and ready to go so that when it comes time to start engaging and asking members to author your bill, they have the space in their legislative package to do so. Because like Kai said, they have a limited number of bills that they can introduce each year. And so you want to make sure that you're not that person who is, a week before the deadline to introduce bills, looking for members to author your bill, and everybody's just like, nope, sorry, can't help you. My legislative package is full, right? So just because it's not January through August, September, doesn't mean you're still not, laying the foundation. You still got to be out there doing the work, conceptualizing, strategizing, building your coalition, that sort of thing.
I like your approach. What are you saying? I shouldn't wait till the last day of bill deadline to try to pass a lot of, get bill authors. Okay, I'm gonna take that up on next.
I mean, unless you're well connected, maybe working for SPI or something.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Well, there are some terms here in this document, and we'll certainly get this out to you. I'll flash those up there really quickly. We talked about enrollment, concurrence, going back to the other side, sending things across the desk, bill author amendments, some of the things we didn't go into detail. Here's some key takeaways, and then I want to go back to some of those questions in the Q&A box there. Make sure we get to as many as we can. You know what? The legislative process is a public process. I know it doesn't always seem that way. They could be hundreds of miles away from you, but each city has a representative that you could hopefully get to their office, either in person or make a phone call or write a letter. It is a public process. Like Leah said, the right strategy can make all the difference. There's a lot of nuances to that. You'll talk about it on Friday. There's some key players, certainly the individuals that have a vote, but I would say that those unelected staff members who are professionals day in, day out, and they're human beings. They really are human beings. The governor can sign, veto, or take no action on a bill. We didn't talk about if a bill is intentionally held up by the author doing the process, maybe to fix things, to work things out, that bill could come back alive in the second year of that session. We didn't talk about that there. Maybe we'll hit on that tomorrow as we talk about the budget. But perhaps this slide, perhaps we'll go to here, but I may need some help in getting to some of these questions and answers there. Okay, some of them have been answered. Stephanie Cogden, hi, how are you? It's good to see that you're here with us. It looks like it's been answered. Harder with charter schools and opportunity schools. Yes, I mean, that's an education conversation about the nuances of moving legislation between traditional public schools and charter schools. I would only just back that out a little bit and say there are some issue areas that are more difficult than others, or that have a broader impact. Climate, for example, maybe energy, for example. Leah's in that space. She could probably speak to that. Or I would just go point to what she said. If it has a constitutional impact, that takes a lot more, right? So that's what I would note on that. I'm looking at the questions. Julian, maybe you can help me out here. How long does a bill take to become a new law? Leah pointed to once it's signed, unless otherwise noted in the bill, it would go into effect January of the next year. But there are some things, if the bill points out, for example, to go into effect on a certain date, or if it's an urgency bill, which would make it go into effect immediately. Do I have that right, Leah? Mm-hmm. Okay. Pam Robinson, hi Pam, how are you? Is there a document that talks about the requirements of the governor taking act 12 days? Okay, yeah, we can make sure that, I think there was, let's see if an answer was in there. Michael, yeah, thanks Michael for putting that in there. We talked about 12 days, and it's from the time that they note it was sent to the governor's desk, marks that 12-day time. Otherwise, we see till September 30th to do something. What else? Did we miss anything else? Miss any questions? Are there more questions?
I think those were the questions that were left. You both have been answering some of these questions along the way, so it's been helpful. And just know, everyone, if you haven't had a chance to put in your question, maybe a question comes later, by all means, reach out to us and we'll be sure to get you an answer. I know we've only got a couple minutes here left, but I just want to take a moment to thank both Leah and Kai for really trying to, for lack of better terms, simplify, again, a rather complex process. We do this intentionally because I think in order for us to be able to engage intentionally in our region, we have to level set a little bit for all of us to be able to play from the same playing field. The more we understand as a region of how the process works, especially for nonprofit organizations where there isn't enough capacity, the more we better understand how this works, the more we'll be able to work collaboratively and go through our strategy sessions together with a little more information about how we strategically work together. The goal here, right, is to ensure that the Inland Empire gets its fair share, right? I mean, there's a lot of funding that moves around the state, but as you all are, I'm sure, very keen on, the Inland Empire often does not get its fair share. And so the more we get organized as a region, the goal is to hopefully bring in more resources, more opportunities. And sometimes these bills that we just talked about, for example, they don't have to be statewide, right? Sometimes bills can be specific to a region, depending on what that is. And oftentimes you'll see that even though the bill is specific to a region, could actually have some positive impacts in other parts of the state, which will actually only better build a stronger coalition for the work that we're doing. So just know that, this is just really more of an informative opportunity here. Tomorrow, we're going to have Leah and Kai come back again to talk about the budget process. If you think that the legislative process was complex, the budget, man, the budget's a whole different ball game. But it'll be another hour-long presentation. I really do hope you all will come back and learn a little bit about it. And for those of you who are familiar with it and just want to come back and rebuff on some of those key pieces of information, we welcome you to come back, share it with your colleagues, and then we'll wrap it up again on Friday with the Inland Empire Community Collaborative on again how nonprofit organizations can meaningfully engage without compromising your 501c3 status. Really sort of wrapping up this whole week together of how do we make sense of this? How do we organize as a region? Where are the best opportunities and windows for us to engage? How do we better advocate for the things that we need in our region? And to Kai and Leah's point is, how are we selecting the best elected officials to help us carry that water? And then using our coalition here in the region to help push that and support them in the process. So thank you all again for being here. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Kai. This was phenomenal. And I look forward to seeing this, joining the conversation again for our next one tomorrow. So thank you, everybody. You all have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.